But we begin tonight with another first for Donald Trump. He was the first president to be twice impeached, the first former president to be indicted on criminal charges, something he accomplished 4 times. And as of today, he will be the first president to enter the White House as a convicted felon. That was the result following his sentencing this morning in a New York City courtroom after a jury back in May unanimously found Trump guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records to cover up the salacious facts about him allegedly sleeping with and paying off a porn actress and a Playboy model so he could get elected president by a largely evangelical voting base back in 2016, something that had been thrown into doubt by the Access Hollywood video, in which he bragged about being able to do to women what he was later found by a jury to have done to E. Jean Carroll, namely grabbing her genitals in an act of sexual abuse. As Judge Juan Marchand revealed last week, the sentence imposed on Mr. Trump, as Marchand called him, rather than putting president in his moniker like so many suck-ups do, even when he's out of office, is an unconditional discharge, meaning Trump gets no jail time, no probation, no fines, but he will now legally be labeled a convicted felon. Now, in one sense, this is the biggest sweetheart deal imaginable for Trump, considering that a New York Times analysis of sentencing outcomes showed that in the past 10 years, no other defendant convicted of falsifying business records in Manhattan received such a lenient sentence. They all received either jail time, probation, fines, or community service. And yes, it is completely unfair and unjust that Trump gets not even a slap on the wrist for his crimes. But see, if you're Donald Trump, this was anything but a sweetheart deal. Now, you have to remember that Trump was raised by his father, Fred Trump, with the belief that there were only 2 types of people, the strong and the weak, the winners and the losers. And today, with the label convicted felon added to his moniker, it's like having the word loser tattooed across his forehead. Make no mistake, this is a humiliation. And we already see him lashing out. There's a reason that Trump spent so much time and effort trying to avoid this day in unsuccessfully reaching out to every court he could, including the U.S. Supreme Court, to try to once again evade accountability for his actions. But this time, regardless of his position, status, and money, he had to face reality. He had to face accountability. Perhaps most really angered Trump was the fact that he, albeit virtually, was forced to sit down and listen to Judge Marchand, a Colombian immigrant, while he lectured him about why he was facing sentencing and why he should not be considered any more privileged than any other citizen of this country. And leave it to Marchand, who literally faced death threats in the service of this case, to deliver a lesson today, not in weaponizing the courts, as Trump likes to claim, but in what should be the reality in America, that no one in this country should consider themselves above the law, not even Donald Trump.
It can be viewed fairly that this has been a truly extraordinary case. And yet, the trial was a bit of a paradox because once the courtroom doors were closed, the trial itself was no more special, unique, or extraordinary than the other 32 criminal trials that took place in this courthouse at the same exact time. It is the legal protections afforded to the office of the President of the United States that are extraordinary, not the occupant of the office. To be clear, the protections afforded the office of the President are not a mitigating factor. They do not reduce the seriousness of the crime or justify its commission in any way. The protections are, however, a legal mandate, which, pursuant to the rule of law, this court must respect and follow. However, despite the extraordinary breadth of those protections, one power they do not provide is the power to erase a jury verdict. It is clear from legal precedent, which until July 1st was scarce, that Donald Trump, the ordinary citizen, Donald Trump, the criminal defendant, would not be entitled to such considerable protections.
I have a great panel here to discuss today's sentencing. Former Manhattan District Attorney Catherine Christian, conservative attorney George Conway, president of the Society for the Rule of Law Institute, Katie Phang, host of the eponymous Katie Phang Show on MSNBC, and Trump biographer David K. Johnston, professor of practice at the Rochester Institute of Technology. David, I do want to start with you because you've been covering Donald Trump the longest, and I would say have known him the longest. I want to play for you what Aaron Rupar, I think, very accurately called Donald Trump's motto in 7 seconds.
And I'd just like to explain that I was treated very, very unfairly, and I thank you very much.
That is what he said as part of his, when he had an opportunity to speak to the court. And that's pretty much the way Trump lives. I have argued and been arguing back and forth with some folks on Blue Sky that we may, and it is unfair. Okay, let's just be clear. This is completely unfair that he gets to not have any jail time or any real sanction. But talk about the way Trump would view what happened to him today.
Oh, to Donald, this is just an outrage. I mean, Donald really does believe he's special. He's above the law. He's been committing crimes his entire adult life. I wrote a roadmap for Alvin Bragg on how to prosecute Donald as a serial tax cheat who fabricated non-existent businesses and used them to cut his taxes from just that made up out of nothing filings with the government. He forged his own lawyer's tax name once on a tax return, for example. And remember, he was tried civilly and twice and lost for income tax fraud. He could have been charged with perjury and other crimes. And so Donald, even being just labeled a felon, is an outrage. That just perfect example of not respecting that he's special.
And he's not. I mean, Katie Phang, I mean, he's so entitled that this is somebody who just assumed that because he appointed 3 of the people on the Supreme Court, he had them in the bag. And he did have most of them in the bag. We had 4 of them in the bag, right? The 4 conservatives were in the bag. I think it's clear. Clarence Thomas gets vacations. He does what he's told. Samuel Alito's, he and his wife are flying pro-Trump flags. I mean, he was on the phone with Trump trying to get his ex-aide a sweet deal, a gig at the Justice Department, making sure, oh, no, sir, he's loyal. You should hire him. That's the kind of sort of corruption he's used to. The only shock here is that John Roberts decided to have a little dignity, and maybe he was just cornered by Judge Merchan, who was like, yeah, I'm not going to sanction him to any jail time, John Roberts. You got anything for that?
But that's the problem, though, right? Because there was that notation in the decision from SCOTUS, Joy, that because Donald Trump wasn't looking at a sentence, I've told people Donald Trump didn't get a sentence, right? He may be a convicted felon, but there was no teeth to what happened. And so that's the reason why you saw Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts decide to join with the liberal side of the SCOTUS bench. There was no consequence. It kind of makes you wonder if there had been the very real threat that he, as in Donald Trump, would have been looking at even probation, a fine, maybe some community service hours. Why don't you put Donald Trump in fire gear and have him go battle the fire in California like some other inmates are doing in California? But the point is, if there had actually been some threat, Joy, I don't know if you would have seen John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett side with the liberal court. And so, you know, I'm troubled by the fact that Merchan didn't even require Donald Trump to show up for the sentencing today. Didn't even give that little amount. Donald Trump could have been sitting on Teams in his pajama bottoms after he came out of the bathroom at Mar-a-Lago looking at classified documents. Nobody knows, but he didn't have to show up like every other defendant needed to do so. I appreciate the work from Judge Merchan and the Manhattan DA's office. I will always laud the work that they did, but this has always been bullshit. And it continues to be that T.S. Eliot poem, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. It was the only one of 4 criminal indictments that went to a jury verdict. He should have been treated like everybody else.
I 100% agree. I 1,000% agree with you, Katie. But George Conway, we also live in the real world in which this is a rich, white Republican. And you have a Supreme Court that we knew was in the bag for him. As Katie just said, if there had been any inkling that he was going to even have to clean up, you know, garbage on the side of the road, John Roberts would have protected him. Everybody knows that. Everybody understands the fundamental corruption of these people. You had Sam Alito literally like within 24 hours of not recusing himself on this case, on the phone with Trump saying, "Don't worry, Mr. Trump. My aide 17 years ago is super loyal. Don't worry that he worked for Bill Barr. He'll be your friend." That's the kind of corruption we're facing. And in a corrupt system, this is the only way that Donald Trump would ever have to face accountability ever, ever, ever. No?
Well, I don't disagree with your characterization of some of the things that the Supreme Court has done, in particular that phone call, and is a little odd. But the fact of the matter is, he was never ever going. Once he was elected again to the Oval Office, he was never going to serve jail time. I mean, it has been the position of the Department of Justice from the Nixon administration to the Clinton administration, and ever since, and nobody has really questioned it, that a sitting president cannot be incarcerated because it would prevent him from doing his constitutional duties under Article 2 of the Constitution. And Article 6 is the supremacy clause, and it overrides everything else, federal law and state law. So there was no, there was never, ever any chance, once he was reelected again, that he was ever going to serve a moment of prison time. There was a possibility that I think I would have sustained a fine if I were the Supreme Court, if I were on the Supreme Court, because the fine is something that would have been imposed before he became president, and he certainly can afford a fine. But I can't disagree with Katie that it's possible that a fine would have triggered a stay of the sentencing. So I think it's best that what happened. And the only criticism I would have of Judge Merchan, who I think has conducted himself in an exemplary fashion, much more faithful to the rule of law than the Supreme Court was last year, is if I were him, I would have done a lengthier analysis where I would have said, here's how I would have ruled if he were John Smith. Okay.